It's my pleasure today to introduce Marco Bresciani, who is our current fellow at the Institute and who will today give a lecture on the topic Understanding and Opposing Fascism, the Political and Intellectual Experience of the Interwar Exile. Marco is Associate Professor at the University of Florence at the Department of Political and Social Sciences. And he will actually today talk about his main research field, which is the political and intellectual history of Italian and European anti-fascism and anti-totalitarianism. And I think we can also say that today's talk is, in fact, a book launch of his recently published book, Learning from the Enemy, an intellectual history of anti-fascism in Interwar Europe, published in 2024 by Verso Books, where actually Marco focused on the case study of the revolutionary anti-fascist group Giustizia, Libertà in the context of the 1930s. And in the meantime, just to say a bit more about his current research, so Marco's research has also encompassed the political and social history of fascism, nationalism and conservatism in interwar Europe. The special focus here has been post-Habsburg Upper Adriatic. And most recently, he has started a new project concerning the local impact of globalization in European peripheries, with special attention to the intellectual and expert networks in the political and economic reconfigurations. And one of the main issues at the core of both these projects is the relationship between state and civil society in transitions and transformations in some critical periods of 20th century European history. So Marco, I give the floor to you and we'll come back later for the questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Isidora, for this very kind presentation. Thanks to the Institute of Contemporary History for having me here. It's really a pleasure to deliver this lecture and actually to try to present and discuss this book that has been published in English this year, but this is a revised version of a book published in Italy in 2017. So this presentation, this lecture was scheduled a few months ago in early September. Now it's mid-December, but discussing anti-fascism seems to be always timely, maybe more timely than ever. And so my attempt here is to try to raise some very easy, basic questions from an historical point of view. The following. What is meant by anti-fascism in historical terms? What's its relationship with fascism? And what do we mean by fascism? Conventional wisdom and traditional scholarship have tended to give pretty easy answers to these questions, stressing, for instance, the unity of the anti-fascist forces or emphasizing the unwavering opposition of anti-fascists to fascism. My idea is that the history of Giustizia e Libertà helped to reformulate and somewhat to give new answers to these questions. Today I will try to briefly introduce you to the history of the group, which is, I suppose, quite unknown. It was a very small group of politicians, intellectuals, constituted in exile in Paris in 1929 and linked to an underground network of oppositionists in Italy fighting against the fascist dictatorship. So I think this is also a topic very appropriate for a conference series entitled to History on the Edge. This was really a group on the edge. And my book is based basically on three levels. The history of the group, of the network and its connections, Giustizia e Libertà, some analysis of the main biographical trajectories of the main jail members, and last but not least, a kind of perspective of intellectual history, a history of political cultures of the 20s and 30s, but also there are pre-war assumptions, roots their interwar developments, and their post-war, post-1945 legacies. Methodologically speaking, my research was based on a kind of situationist approach to the history of ideas, a kind of context-sensitive approach to intellectual developments, stressing the changing of context and contingencies in order to try to understand choices, dilemmas, contradictions, alternatives of the fascist vis-à-vis the fascist challenges, and more broadly vis-à-vis the illiberal authoritarian threats that were spreading all over Europe in the late 20s and especially in the 30s. So to start with the history of Giustizia e Libertà, just some basic information about the chronologies and the geographies of the history of the group. As I said, the group was constituted by Carlo Rosselli in October 1929. Carlo Rosselli had just come in Paris from his confinement in Lipari Island with a very bold and venturous escape from the fascist confinement. And he decided to organize a completely new movement, a revolutionary movement based on the idea of an anti-fascist revolution. At the time, we have to keep in mind that most of the Italian anti-fascist opposition were fragmented, dispersed. The fascist dictatorship, at least since 1925-26, was really on the rise. Its repressive apparatus was stronger than ever. And a growing popularity was also gaining Mussolini and his government. So vis-à-vis this fragmented landscape, Rosselli tried to catalyze, mobilize all different currents of the existing political movements and groups, socialists, Republicans, Democrats of any sort, with exclusion of the communists, as we'll see, and appealing to different social layers, working classes and middle classes. His idea was based on a very strong polemic against communists, against Marxist perspectives, against communist models. At the same time, he had a clear-cut break with the model of the mass political parties. He was very much critical towards the Socialist Party. He blamed it for the defeat of 1922, for the fascist victory. But more in general, he looked for a completely new model of political organization, trying to combine both politics and culture. And he, for instance, he organized some debates, some intellectual initiatives, some new means of propaganda in Paris in order to mobilize the French and more broadly the international public opinion vis-à-vis the anti-fascist cause. At the same time, we had to consider that alongside this group in exile, there was also a branch in Italy fighting against the fascist regime. And this underground network was based in the main Italian towns, Rome, Milan, Florence, Turin, Trieste. But quite quickly, the fascist repression tended to disband most of these networks, first in Milan, 1930, and especially in Turin, which was really the hub of this network between 1934 and 1935. And these waves of arrest and repression marked a significant decline of the conspiratorial activities of Giustizia e Libertà in Italy. Meanwhile, lively debates took place in the exile, and this meant also growing divergences, growing fractures between the different members of Giustizia e Libertà as far as regard the judgment of the Russian revolutions, the idea of Bolshevism, Soviet Union, and Stalin's regime, the relationship between anti-fascism and Italian nationalism, and more generally, different ways of conceiving and practicing an anti-fascist revolution. This led also to people leaving the group, like Gaetano Salvemini and Andrea Caffi in the mid-1930s. The group in general, at that time, was increasingly identified with the leadership, the political leadership of Carlo Rosselli and his political line, appealing for an anti-fascist revolution that had to be a political revolution, first of all, and had to take place as soon as possible. And according to Rosselli, the Italian war against Ethiopia, broken out in October 1935, marked the first opportunity to deal a blow against the fascist regime. He was convinced that that war might represent really the starting of the beginning of the collapse of the fascist empire, the fascist regime and empire. That collapse didn't take place, as we know, but he was convinced that the group had to organize for the upcoming anti-fascist revolution. And a real opportunity to tackle fascists on the battleground came a few months later when the Spanish Civil War broke out. And Rosselli organized a small military unit that was organized within the anarchist groups in Barcelona, and then went to fight on the Aragona front between August and December 1936. However, again, misunderstandings, divergences with the anarchist group at that time, and especially on the ground of different perspectives of combining the anti-fascist war and the social revolution, pushed Rosselli out of the battlefront and then encouraged him to go back to France. In spring 1937, while he was recovering from his experience, he was also injured during his experience in Spain. He wrote a series, quite a known series of articles appealing for a new party of the Italian proletariat, identifying that party with the party of anti-fascism. And so he started to rethinking his relationship to Marxism, communism, and the working class more in general. This rethinking was suddenly and ruthlessly stopped by his murder in June 1937 by a French terrorist group, the so-called XAR, La Cagoule, that was paid and ordered by Mussolini himself. And Carlo Rosselli was killed alongside his brother Nello, a quite important historian. The last part of the history of Giustizia Libertà survived after the murder, lasted until 1940, and it was characterized by quite interesting debates about socialism, communism, liberalism, also in the light of an increasingly important problem that is the problem of comparison between different experiences, totalitarian experiences, so the problem of totalitarianism. Of course, Carlo Rosselli played a critical role within this story, and his biography is important to understand what's at stake in this story. I will just, without going too much into detail, I will just briefly mention some interesting and important elements of his biography, of his intellectual and political biography, in order to understand the development of the group and the very meaning of his understanding of anti-fascism. Carlo Rosselli was born in 1899 in Rome, but he came from a Jewish family, partly from Florence, partly from Livorno, partly from Venice. And his culture was quite early shaped by the Florentine nationalist environment, an environment that was pretty critical towards post Risorgimento liberal Italy, and at the same time it was very much critical towards the democratic experimentation carried out by Giovanni Giolitti in the early 20th century Italy. But a major break in his life was represented, of course, by the experience of the Great War. One of his brothers were killed on the front line, and he came out of the war. He didn't take part in the active fighting, but he was somewhat mobilized and trained for the war, and he came out of the war experience with a strong desire to radically change Italy. At the same time, he was very critical of revolutionary socialism, and he was, of course, also very critical of the rising communist movement. So he tried to combine his nationalist education with a project of democratic renewal of Italy that at that point was quite confused. And he was somewhat also tempted by the fascist option at that time. And between 1922 and 1923, when the ascent of Mussolini to power made clear that divisions within the Italian politics and society were deepening, he took a strong stance against fascism and against Mussolini's government. Since the very beginning, since then, he understood his anti-fascist stance as a new form of revolution, as a revolution based on the idea that anti-fascism represented and catalyzed all the bad vices, all the bad things of the Italian history. And so he had to fight against fascism in order to really renovate Italy. Meanwhile, he became a scholar. He taught at the University of Genoa and then at the University of Milan. And he was a specialist in political economy, in history and theory of the trade unions. And he started rethinking both the history and theory of liberalism and socialism. While teaching, he was also involved in the first anti-fascist initiatives. At a certain point, 1926, he was arrested and then sent to the confinement in Lipari Island. And it was there that he started elaborating his only theoretical work that was then published in France and in French in 1930 as liberal socialism, socialismo liberale, or socialisme libéral in French. And this work tried to combine both the political cultures, traditions of socialism and liberalism, starting from a critical assessment of Marxist classism and determinism. He thought that socialism might be the only possible form of liberalism under 20th century conditions. And he thought that socialism was the real proper heir of liberalism in the 20th century. This was his ideological starting point. Of course, then the movement of Giustizia Libertà collected very different inspirations, very different traditions, as we have already said. Another major breaking point, turning point in his biography was marked by the ascent of Hitler to power. And so the perception that fascism couldn't be reduced to an Italian problem, but fascism was more generally a European problem. And so he realized that the expansion of fascism all over Europe as kind of kind of catalyzer of very different forms of far-right movements, groups and regime, was to be understood and then fought from a really new revolutionary perspective. And so he tried to combine his previous claim to a new democratic national Italian tradition with an increasing interest in Europe and especially in federalism. So we can say that there are many Carlo Rossellis that somewhat shifted positions and overlapped different inspirations and reacted in very different ways over time with the changing of context of the 30s. And in the last period of his life, we can say that there was a kind of radicalization, as I also have already mentioned, towards a new stance, less critical towards Marxist classism and more open also to try to combine Soviet model and Western legacies and democratic legacies. All these radicalization happened, we can say, since 1935 onwards in the context of the Ethiopian, of the Italian war against Ethiopia and of the Spanish Civil War, and more generally of the collapsing of the Versailles order. One of the methodological means I used in order to try to unpack the history of the group was a generational approach. So I tried to see how different generations contributed to the history of the group and to different debates and different sensibilities within the group. We can articulate these generational layers in at least three. That is, one of people come of age before the Great War, and I just mentioned Salvemini, Silvio Trentini, Andrea Caffi, or one of people come of age during the Great War. Carlo Rosselli was, of course, among them, and Emilio Lussu, for instance, was another one. And people come of age after the Great War. Carlo Levi, Vittorio Foa, Leone Ginzburg, Nicola Chiaramonte, Franco Venturi were among them. This generational approach allowed me to differentiate the different contributions to the different debates put forward by all these people, at the same time to show the common grounds, especially between the people come of age during the Great War, siding with the anti-fascist side. On the other hand, people taking place within the fascist movement. So the idea that if you look at these people from a generational point of view, you see also many similarities and commonalities between people that would become anti-fascist and fascist after the war. They had really common cultural roots going back to the early 20th century culture. Of course, these different generational belonging also meant different sensibilities and different attitudes towards the main events of the time, the Great War, the Russian Revolution, and the ascent of fascism. So the main idea of the book was to try to rethink the history of anti-fascism, taking into account also the history of fascism, considering that both of them dynamically change over time. And at the same time, they were dynamically interconnected with each other. So to people like Rosselli, fascism was really a turning point. The world in the 20s and 30s was really reshaped by the fascist experiences. So it represented a kind of new normality, as a kind of point of no return to pre-Italy, pre-fascist Italy and pre-fascist Europe. So any kind of anti-fascism that would try to rebuild a post-fascist order should have started from the changes that have been steered by fascism itself. At the same time, they consider fascism as a kind of catalyzer, a driver of major changes all over Europe. So their own anti-fascism tightly depended on the change that fascism imposed on political and social order of Italy and Europe at the time. And in this regard, the time played a critical role, as one of the main aims of Mussolini was to last over time, to keep on challenging Italy and Europe from its own perspective, to last until the very last moment. As this was his task, as was this his aim, also the different oppositionist group and accordingly Giustizia Libertà had to think not only in terms of short-term tactics, but also in terms of long-term strategies. They had to combine their conception time and shape it on the basis of the conception time of the fascists. And this is also why they really were very much interested in trying to educate a new post-fascist ruling class, combining both politics and culture. This combination was the key to try to think of the fascist challenges of a new possible post-fascist order on the long-term period. Yeah. Of course, large part of this story took place in the exile, and I think that in this respect, this book tries to contribute to a new transnational understanding of the history of anti-fascism, moving away from very traditional stories of anti-fascism that were very much built on nationalistic frameworks. So the idea is that although the group was very much connected to the Italian national tradition, to the Risorgimento culture, to nationalist culture from the early 20th century, the experience of the exile encouraged them to open, reframe, and rethink their own horizons, and to try to integrate new suggestions, new insights, new experiences and perspectives. And their connections with intellectuals coming from France or from elsewhere, as well as their connections with other political exiles living in Paris in the 30s, were really critical, in this process to rethink their own relationship with the national tradition. At the same time, these suggestions were very important in trying to sketch new political, intellectual perspectives. I would like just to mention, for instance, their interest in planism, the ideas of Henri de Man, a German socialist who tried to cope with the social effects of the Great Depression, claiming for a new public intervention in order to secure the economy, in order to try to mobilize the consensus of the middle classes that were very much leaning towards fascism on an anti-fascist ground. So planism, the idea of a kind of democratic plan in competition, of course, with the Soviet idea of planning was openly and widely discussed by the group. Le Neosocialisme by Marcel Déat was another set of ideas that were very much important, stemming from a debate that took place within the French Socialist Party in 1933-34. Here the idea was that socialism had to compete with fascism in order to try to catalyze as much consensus as possible. And they had also to appropriate the nationalist and authoritarian watchwords in order to compete with fascism. This was, of course, a quite ambiguous movement. We have to take in mind that Marcel Déat then became a collaborationist in the early 40s. He took part in the Vichy regime, so he got closer and closer to the Nazi experience. But at that time, neo-socialism was really proposed as a new form of anti-fascism. And Carlo Rosselli was very much connected with that. Still, the idea of a new pluralism, trying to reform the relationship between state and civil society, institutions and individuals, was very much discussed by the group. And here the most important name was Georges Gurevitch, a Russian, French law scholar, a jurist, who theorized this idea of a juridical and social pluralism as an answer to the failures of classical liberalism. But they were also interested, as in the case of neo-socialism, in ideas, in non-conformist ideas coming from other intellectual environments, like the group of Esprit, the personalism by Emmanuel Mounier. So they were very much sensitive to all those elaborations that, starting from a strong perception of the crisis of European civilization and the need to give some answers to this crisis. They also talk about, in this context, about a kind of European civil war. This is a controversial term. This became quite controversial in the 1980s because of the use that a very conservative German historian like Ernst Nolte made of this term, European civil war, trying to compare Soviet communism and Nazism, the Gulag and Auschwitz. But this term was very much present in the 30s, and Carlo Rosselli repeatedly used it in order to describe what was at stake in the politics at that time. And according to him, this European civil war was a war especially between fascists and anti-fascists. And what was at stake was the future of Europe itself. So this was one of the ways in which he internalized the traumatic impact of the ascent of Hitler to power and tried to figure out a new European order after that. As I have already said, at first, Carlo Rosselli was quite critical towards the communist Marxist world at large. And the group also had very blurred visions of the Russian revolutions, the Bolshevik regime, Stalin's Soviet Union. André Caffi was a main protagonist of these debates. He was born in Imperial Russia, in St. Petersburg. He became part of the group since the very beginning, but he had a very twisted biographical trajectories coming from Imperial Russia. He took part in the Russian revolutionary movement. Then he went into exile. He fought the First World War first on the French front, then on the Italian front. Then he went to Moscow at the time of the Bolshevik takeover. He sympathized with the Bolshevik experiment. Then he was arrested. He elaborated a very critical view, a very interesting view of the Russian revolutions. He came to Italy at the time when Mussolini was taking power, and then he fled to France, and he connected with Carlo Rosselli. So he brought to the movement, to the debates of Giustizia e Libertà, a very first-hand documentation, a set of very interesting interpretations of the Russian revolutionary experiences. And it always took a very critical stance towards Stalin's Soviet Union, especially after the beginning of Stalin's terror in December 1934. But at that time, because of the new politics of the popular fronts, all the movement, and especially Carlo Rosselli has said, was shifting toward a more lenient attitude towards Soviet Union and more open attitude towards a collaboration, at least, with the communist forces under the banner of the popular fronts. So the group was really split by very harsh debates about this relationship between Soviet communism and anti-fascism, popular fronts, and the idea of an anti-fascist revolution. As I already said, one other interesting aspect of the debates within the group was concerned the relationship between anti-fascism and anti-totalitarianism. We tend to see these two political intellectual discourses as kind of mutually exclusive in terms of, especially if we consider the Cold War use of anti-totalitarianism. But again, we have to consider that in the 30s, anti-totalitarian and anti-fascist discourses were very much present, and they were intertwined with each other. The very adjective of totalitarian was for the first time used by a friend of Carlo Rosselli, Giovanni Amendola, a liberal democratic politician intellectual in 1923, and the term circulated widely in the debates of Giustizia e Libertà all over the 30s, but especially after Carlo Rosselli's murder in 1937, the use of the term totalitarian and totalitarianism in order to rethink all the ambivalences, contradictions, dilemmas within European socialism were widely used. And they somewhat critically reassessed all the period of the popular fronts, and they took again a critical attitude towards Soviet communism and the possibility of a collaboration with communists in the name of anti-fascism. Here I should mention at least this French historian, Elia Lévy, who was a close friend of Carlo Rosselli and was especially well known for this conference held in Paris in 1936 about the era of tyrannies. And in this conference, he explicitly compared different political experiments of Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism. This conference was widely discussed within the group in the following years. Okay, I would like just to add a couple of things going to the conclusions. First of all, as I'm talking about this story of Giustizia e Libertà in Ljubljana, I think it's worth stressing that there was a peculiar Central European dimension of all these debates. Of course, when I approach all this story, I especially investigated from the point of view of Western European intellectual history, and especially from the point of view of Italian-French intellectual connections. But over time, I realized that there were deeper, really fascinating, interesting connections between those debates and other networks and debates involving East Central Europe at that time. This was, first of all, because a couple at least of the main members of the group came from East Central Europe. I've already mentioned Andrea Caffi. I should also mention Leone Ginzburg, who was born in Odessa in 1909. By the way, he is the father of the renowned Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg. And he was part of this network since the very beginning. He was operating in Turin's underground network. And like Caffi, he brought into the group quite typically a very important contribution in terms of Russian culture and very important ideas about the Russian Revolution and its legacies. But I would like also to stress that also all the reflection, all the consideration about the European federalism were increasingly thought as an attempt to provide solutions to all those conflicts and problems that have emerged out of the collapse of the continental empires. So post-Habsburg European federalism was discussed as a possible solution to all those post-imperial conflicts that had shaken East Central Europe after 1918. And Andrea Caffi, in particular, was very much a proponent of all these ideas in terms of a European reorganization of society, in terms of a new federation of individuals and groups. So overcoming a model of nation-state that was considered apt only for Western Europe and especially for France and the kind. Also, Austro-Marxist ideas very much circulated in the group, but I won't go too much into detail. Maybe we can come back to that later. So I would like just, in conclusion, to say a couple of words about the title of the book, which is also the key of my interpretation, Learning from the Enemy. And here you can read a quotation from a letter of Vittorio Foa, who was one of the members of Giustizia Libertà. At the time, he was a very young activist in Turin, and he was in prison when he wrote this letter. Maybe it's worth reading it?
Is it supposed to be on the slide? Or?
Sorry, yes, but I forgot to, yeah. Yes, you know, I thought that, yeah, sorry, I made a mistake. Anyway. Why did you tell me that the slide didn't? Okay, sorry, I completely forgot that. So you had all these slides. Maybe I can forward them to you. So anyway, maybe I can read it. Unlike the Weiners, so I say we because I truly hope that there are others who think as I do not believe in irrational actions and set ourselves the task of recognizing their rationality in order to establish the rules governing our actions. There is a huge gulf between the Weiners and us, one established by our common adversaries. The Weiners complain about the collapse of the little world, whereas we internalize the demands that our adversaries strive to meet and enrich them with new, higher, more complex demands. The Weiners oppose the abstract model of civilization to history. We, by contrast, feel that we are an integral and active part of our own time, which we do not repudiate. Indeed, we feel it to be all the more our own, the more it apparently seems to wrong us. So this idea is that you have to consider fascism as a kind of rational solution to problems. You have to start from the problems that fascism raises in order to find different answers. You cannot just reject their answers, but you have to consider them and to elaborate them in order to move away and find new answers to the problems fascists are trying to answer. So this also relates to this idea that you have to try to think in very interactive terms, both anti-fascism and fascism. Fascism somewhat starting from the problems of his own time, especially from problems raised by the Great War, And jail members, although they rejected the answers of fascism, thought that it was necessary to start from the problems they were trying to cope with. Okay, and just to finish, what do they learn from fascism? Here you can find a kind of list of potential lessons they learned from fascism. Jail, first of all, appropriated the willingness to face the enemy by resorting to all sorts of means, even those of a paramilitary nature. Second, Jail understood the importance of symbolic mobilization through the massive use of modern propaganda. Third, as opposed to the class-based culture of the Marxist left, it internalized the need to mobilize the middle classes at a time when we're leaning towards authoritarianism and liberalism, or even fascism itself. Fourth, like radical fascist currents, it too borrowed the ideas of nationhood and Europe from the Mazzini tradition, but applied them to various forms of revolutionary anti-fascism as the grounds for the new post-fascist and post-imperial order. Last but not least, GL developed plans for a mixed economy and public policies as counter-cyclical responses to the 1930s crisis, while confronting cultural pessimism with its belief in progress, disputed as they might have been. Okay, so with these points, I would end my lecture. I'm very sorry that you couldn't follow the slides, but I didn't realize that they were moving, so sorry for that. Okay, thank you.
So much, Marco. I also hadn't realized until the end because I thought that you just had one slide.
No, yeah.
Okay,
there were several of them, but okay. Maybe you can see it.
We can now slides when we will discuss.
Or we do it from the beginning. Okay, so I'll open the floor for questions now, if there are any. To start with. I mean, if not right now, maybe I can start with a question or two. I wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about this relationship between liberalism and communism in your research, because somehow you mentioned this example of how Carlo Rosselli was rethinking it. But then would you say more generally that there was a certain kind of fusion between the two by this anti-fascist generation of the interwar period? And I'm wondering also if you would say that it's more useful to explore their anti-fascism and their approach to these earlier versions of ideologies through their ideological or rather through generational lenses. This is one question, and then the second is more relates to how maybe how you as a historian approached the topic when you began to research it, because I was reading the introduction to the book. And you said that you had been working on the topics of the relationship between communism and anti-fascism since the 1990s. But then after the economic crisis hit and after everything changed in a way, you started to rethink some of the questions that you had thought about earlier. So I was wondering then, could you reflect a bit more about what changed in your approach to the topic as the time has passed, and how have these questions about anti-fascism and communism changed since the mid-90s? And I'm asking this also because I have a strong feeling that after the economic crisis, a lot of how we see the 1930s and how we research this period has changed, and maybe it relates a bit more to what we are living through now. So this is what I'm wondering to hear more.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Isidora. I will start from the second question. These are very good questions. I mean, I will try to really summarize the sense of my trajectory. When I started in the late 90s, I mean, there was a lot of public debate about anti-fascism, of course, in Italy as elsewhere. This was the time of the crisis of the Italian political party system based on anti-fascism. So there was a lot of discussion about if it's possible to revive a form of anti-fascism in the new post-1989 political Italian system. At the same time, I read, for instance, Eric Hobsbawm, François Furet, and their ideas of relationship. There are very different ideas of the ways in which one might relate communism and anti-fascism. So both of them, neither Hobsbawm nor Furet, paradoxically dealt with the Italian case, which is, of course, in many ways a major case, because in some ways, unluckily, we have to experience both of them earlier than other countries. And so I thought that the case of Giustizia Libertà might be an interesting example in order to try to rethink the ways in which anti-fascism and communism might relate to each other. And I started especially from writing the biography of this Russian-born intellectual, Andrea Caffi, because, of course, he had a he went through very different stages in his life, and at first he had a quite sympathetic attitude towards Soviet communism. Then he thought all this, and he used also the category of totalitarianism in order to describe what he meant for the Soviet communist experiment and its similarities or differences with other totalitarian experiments. So this was my first focus. I wanted to try to unpack this complex relation because, of course, then from a certain point of view, communist, the Third International and Soviet Union provided resources, forces for fighting fascism, especially after 1935. It was really hard to think of an anti-fascist movement or front without the contribution, the even material contribution, of course, the organizational contribution of the communist world. On the other hand, these small groups somewhat felt very deeply potential contradictions and tensions between their own understanding of anti-fascist commitment, ideas and experiences of the international working class, and so their the understanding and the practice of anti-fascism within the workers' movement in Western Europe, and the fact that all this coincided with one of the worst period of Stalin's terror in Soviet Union. So this was an open issue, an open problem. So if you have to, emphasize your somewhat moral and intellectual integrity, or you have to emphasize the need to fight, the political need to fight fascism. Then after 2008, I tried to put together all these debates within a more complex framework, and I especially tried to put more attention to all different ways and means they trying to cope not only with fascism, but more in general with the crisis stemming from political crisis stemming from the Great Depression, and so all the different set of solutions they try to point out in order to, prevent fascism, not only to fight it. So this was also the impact of the 2008 crisis on my research, so to speak. But more in general, I think that for sure. The idea that totalitarianism couldn't be isolated as a problem in itself, but you have to put it in context and to see the different ways in which it was debated and the different potential tensions with other options and solutions was somewhat put in discussion by 2008 crisis, I think. And so in some way this was also the end of a Cold War legacy in intellectual terms, I would say. Yes. The other question?
And liberalism and socialism.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think that, as said, we have very different Carlo Rossellis. And in the 20s, he was more a political thinker than a politician. So you can find very clear ideas of what he meant by liberalism and socialism. And he really tried to elaborate a way of combining them. Basically, the idea was that democratic institution couldn't, get rid of the working classes. So you have to include the working classes into this new form of democratic project. And this idea of combining liberalism and socialism was a way of legitimizing this process of integration. But then over the 30s, he used this term in more ambiguous, somewhat confused ways, because they became somewhat means to legitimize his political choices on the ground when he was trying to, lead a small political movement, but a movement, as I tried to demonstrate, that was very much divided and that experienced increasing divergences and fractures. So he tried to keep the movement together. At the same time, he tried to, adapt the movement and its political and ideological perspectives to the changing context. So it's really hard to find a coherent way of understanding those terms over the 30s. But yes, and I think that in general, politics became much more important to him than it was in the 20s. So, he accepted that there could be contradictions, dilemmas, and non-solved alternatives in his own political thought.
And how specific was this for Rosselli, or was it also? Could you also say that it was for others?
I think there is a kind of a specific element in Rosselli's, because he was the leader of the group. So he had at the same time to, try to develop his own political thought and trying to keep all the group together. And this was a huge effort. And finally, it was a very much fragmented group, but I think that this is also part, of course, of the history of the European left more in general. So, but what is interesting is that you see very different arguments around the main topics. And so you can really closely read all these different arguments and see how they articulate them into concrete contexts. And so, for instance, what does it mean in the 30s to refer to the Italian tradition of Risorgimento? They wrestled this tradition from the fascists, but at the same time they try to overcome it. So there are tensions playing out over time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you, Marco. My question relates a little bit to your question, Isidora. I actually have two questions and one curiosity. The first thing would be, you mentioned Rosselli switched or had a change from more like a thinker to a politician.
Mm-hmm.
So my question here would be, can we trace this in general? So was there a development up from political ideas to political agency? So how did this group translate their ideas and their discussions into actual practices?
Mm-hmm.
The second question is also then a little bit related to you. You mentioned that we can divide the group into before, during, and after the Great War. So I wonder about clashes between those generations, mostly in terms of their genuine ideas and strategies against fascism. And here I had what was about key events. So like the hyperinflation in Germany was, for example,
Mm-hmm.
think of a key event that changed the argumentation and changed their point of views against fascism. So I wondered, on the one hand side, the clashes between those generations, and on the other hand, of possible key events except the Great War? And the last thing then is curiosity. So what would you think actually? Because I had a little bit this idea, or it came to my mind, that anti-fascism here was very much passive, and they reacted to fascism and to fascist actions. So I wondered, do you think that this would be a major disadvantage for anti-fascist movements in general, that they somehow need the fascist action to react and can't get into action without fascism? So does this make sense actually? Because it came to my mind that this is really problematic for them to set an own agenda, because they need the fascist action they can react on. Just what is your what you think? But yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, I will start from this last question. That is very interesting, and maybe it helps me to clarify one major aspect of their own conception of anti-fascism, because yes, in some ways, I agree with you. I mean, they had somewhat to set their own agenda on the basis of the transformations and choices made by Mussolini and his regime. But at the same time, they claim they had their own agenda, and they claim that their own anti-fascism shouldn't be just a negative anti-fascism. So they made very much clear that they weren't victims of fascism. They were somewhat persecuting fascism. They were rejecting actively fascism in the name of a post-fascist order. So the idea is that they were moving away from the present. They were trying to connect the present to the future, and they were working in this direction. So in terms of, at least of intellectual history, they were trying not to be, reduced to a kind of a reactive dimension, but they try to really develop a kind of positive way of understanding anti-fascism. And this is also why, for instance, Carlo Rosselli quite often repeated that is anti-fascism somewhat identified with a new form of humanism. The idea that a new idea of political and social relations might come out of the defeat of the fascist regimes in Europe. But as I said, they were thinking in very long-term perspective. So they thought that they might lose the political battles in the present or in the short-term period, but they might win, the final battle. So this idea of somewhat, it was of course a kind of messianic, apocalyptic idea, but I didn't mention that because I was running out of time. Most of their ideas were somewhat appropriated after the Second World War. By the Italian ruling class, for instance, the idea of a mixed economy, or the idea of an anti-fascist nationalism, or the idea of European federalism, were very much there in the late 40s, 50s, 60s. And some of these ideas were taken out of the fascist agenda and were somewhat translated in anti-fascist terms and transferred to the new ruling classes. So this apportion, in my opinion, is very much important, because you cannot think of post-1945 democracy building just as a process that out of the blue put democracy at place. You needed new ideas for legitimizing that process, and you needed a set of solutions that had been already pointed out by the fascist experiences, and but you had to re-legitimize them within the new anti-fascist organization. So people who had taken part in these experiences, or the writings of the group, were very much important in this process of translation of ideas from the fascist field to the anti-fascist field. So, as far as regards practices, yes. Of course, there was very much self-promotion in some ways. They were saying that they were, practicing anti-fascism. They did what they could, especially the people in the exile. But there was a strong action in terms of international propaganda. They tried in any way. They tried in many ways to convince the international public opinion that fascism meant a new war for Europe. So the idea was that from the very beginning that fascism wasn't only an Italian problem, but sooner or later would become a European problem. And this would become a European problem because fascism wasn't only about internal regimes, but was about regimes that were projecting their own ambitions abroad. So the idea that the expansion of fascism in Europe would mean a new continental war at a certain point was very much there. Since October 1933, Carlo Rosselli wrote a clear article that Hitler meant a new war, and Mussolini was ready to cooperate with this war effort. So, but of course, you have also other practices of the underground networks, and again, here you have a very small actions of propaganda by the action. For instance, they try to show up their own anti-fascist ideas with, manifestos or circulating leaflets of Giustizia, Libertà. They were trying, to catalyze all those very few people that might be in favor of fighting fascism. And these were very, small-scale actions, but they somewhat try to, and they especially try in any way to, also take inspiration from fascist propaganda in order to, for instance, at the center point, they bought oh my God. I have the French, un avion. An airplane, exactly. They bought the airplane and they tried to, spread anti-fascist leaflets all over Rome in 1931. And the pilot died while coming back to Corsica. But so they tried to somewhat, make evident that someone was still fighting against fascism. And in their opinion, this was very much important, especially for people who had been educated or was growing up under the fascist regime, so who didn't experience any other form of regime before that. And speaking in terms of generations, yes, of course, I would rather say that more than the classical turning points were very much important to them. So, of course, the Great War, but the 1922, of course, the ascent of fascism to power was a turning point. And then in the 30s, 1933, 34, not only the ascent of Hitler to power, but also the defeat of the Viennese Commune and the repression of the uprising in the Asturias were very much important, because on the one hand there was some pressure, anti-fascist pressure from below, some anti-fascist mobilization from below. On the other hand, they realized that all these actions really didn't succeed. So this really affected the internal debates and the internal projects of the group. So thank you.
Any further questions in person or on Zoom?
I have one question that you already mentioned, that those principles of the group were taking ground after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And we already also mentioned that after in the 90s, those principles were somehow not so acknowledged in the society in Italy. So I have basically two questions. What's left? Usually we ask ourselves what's left from the left, what's left from the Giustizia Libertà. Now, are there discussions, intellectual discussions about this tradition of this group going on in Italy? because as we all know now, this kind of, I suppose the anti-fascist ideology is not the most acknowledged right now. And another thing, what about their nationalism and relations to neighbors, especially, of course, to the northeast and east? And maybe this is two small questions.
Let me just add a third one briefly, because you mentioned Austro-Marxism, so you can just say a couple of sentences. I would be very interested.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much. Yes, I would say, of course, there is no public debate about Giustizia e Libertà at the moment in Italy, but there is some scholarly debate. There is a small group of researchers still working on biographies of some of these people involved in this group and in the group that was heir to Giustizia e Libertà, that is the Partito d'Azione, the Action Party, which was a party that took shape between 1942 and 1946-47. This was a kind of new Giustizia e Libertà that took shape during the war and was one of the major forces fighting the Italian resistance. And like Giustizia e Libertà, this was a very heterogeneous group trying to combine liberals, Democrats, socialists, of course. So there is some research going on, but I think that, no public impact, I'm afraid, for that. And although, of course, as you mentioned, nationalism, and I think that this is something that is very important. And I realized, for instance, that when I rewrote this English version of the book, the problem of the nationalist root of all these biographies and of the ideological template of the group as such is much more evident than in the Italian version. So I realized that rethinking all that in a different language became much more evident, and this is interesting in some sense. And I think that the problem of the relationship between anti-fascism and nationalism is really, really important. I would add not only for the Italian anti-fascism, more in general for all the very different anti-fascist experiences, starting from France, Slovenia, and elsewhere. Especially in post-1945 period, the history of anti-fascism, as I said, was written very much in national terms. So the problem of nationalism wasn't so clearly seen, but if you look at that in more broader, in broader terms, in more European terms, you see that the nation and the nation state were really basic and crucial assumption in their ways of conceiving conceiving politics. So yes, they tended to still be embedded within this nationalistic horizon. Although some of them, and not incidentally, for instance, someone coming from Imperial Russia that had experienced in very different ways exile, try to question nationalism within the group, and so try to question nationalism and its relation with anti-fascism. But I think that there is much more work to do.
So this kind of federalistic assumption, federalistic ideas, and we've seen some kind of trying to negotiate their own nationalism with more cosmopolitan, open idea that they usually quote because they were political philosophers, that they knew that they cannot only rely on a container of nationalist thought.
Yeah, exactly. Some of them, I think, for instance, under Carfi, for sure, somewhat had already moved away from a really nationalist framework. For instance, in 1935, the group was really split by a very vibrant controversy about the meaning of risorgimento. And so, is really revolutionary? Is anti-fascism really revolutionary if it tends always to refer to this risorgimento? Can be really revolutionary, still referring to nationhood, nation states. And so the answer here that Andakafi was trying to suggest was that they have to move away and try just to rethink in terms of a complete radical reorganization of Europe in federalist terms, and overcoming the very model of nation state that was, as I said, considered as a model shaped by the needs and by the history of France, and somewhat transferred to other regions and historical experiences like the Central European ones. So he suggested to reject on that, but this was a minority of them, of a minority group. So it was really just a person, or at least a couple of them. So, and Austrian-Marxism. Austrian-Marxism was important with many regards. First of all, this idea of a plurality of ways to try to create socialism. So the idea that the need or the necessity to resort to a violent revolution depends on the context. And so you have countries where, and you have contingencies that require violence and revolutionary violence, and you have contexts that require parliamentary negotiation and reforms. That was very much there. They were this was discussed, and so like Otto Bauer, they were trying to find their own third way in many ways, and each member of the group was trying to find his own third way. So you have many third ways even within these groups. But the idea is that you have to try to combine reform and revolution in different ways and degrees according to the contingencies. At the same time, they were very much interested in this idea of autonomy. And so the idea of trying to rethinking the political and social system in terms of non-territoriality, in terms of personality, in terms of social groups that could somewhat act as substitute of the state authorities. This was very much there. So they tried to combine, for instance, Proudhon and Austrian-Marxism. And they tried to rethink the relationship between state and society in this new federalist, autonomist, pluralist perspective. So this is what they got for. But of course, they were also very much interested in 1936 when Otto Bauer published the book Between Two World Wars, were very much interested in his own idea of the social, economic, political effects of the Great Depression. And some of them were quite sympathetic with his own new rethinking of the role of Soviet Union within the historical development of Europe more broadly.
Thank you so much. Last chance to ask something. If not, then I invite non-Zoom participants to join us for coffee. And just to announce that we'll see you also next week, same time, same place. So Wednesday at 1 p.m. Niklas Plaza will have a presentation titled From Crop to Crystal, Sugar Beets and the Transformation of the Habsburg Empire from 1848 to 1914. So we hope to see you here next week as well. And yes, thank you so much, Marco.
Thank you to you.
Let's move slowly.